Say, Jack, here's a strange one. This car has the new 440 engine, but there's a carburetor on it I haven't seen before, and I can't find it in the service manual. What's the story?
Well, Tony, that's the new Holley 4-barrel carburetor used on all the standard 440s, except those with cleaner air package. And you're in luck. Tech's here to help me out with an explanation of the Holley. Can I count on you, Tech?
Anytime, Jack. But I am kind of surprised at you. The carburetor isn't covered in the manuals because the manuals were printed before all the specifications were finalized. But you got a service bulletin on the Holley just after you got the manual. Did you forget?
My face is red, Tech. But with your able assistance, I'll make up for that right now. There are some things that are different about this carburetor. For instance, the secondary throttle valves are vacuum-operated, and the secondary side also has an idle system, in addition to the primary idle system. But let's just take those things up as we come to them. We'll talk about the float system first. There's a single fuel inlet on the primary side of the carburetor to feed both float bowls. A fuel transfer tube branches off from the inlet to feed the secondary bowl. And, of course, each bowl has an independent float, needle, and seat.
Are the two floats, needles, and seats interchangeable from primary to secondary?
New parts are interchangeable, but the fuel inlet baffles are not. Those are the white plastic pieces that slide over the inlet seats. There's another tube called a balance tube between the primary and secondary fuel bowls. This tube helps to maintain the correct balance and fuel level between the two fuel bowls. If for any reason either fuel level should get too high, the excess fuel will run through the balance tube into the other bowl, so the tube serves as sort of an overflow.
Don't get that tube confused with the bowl-to-air cleaner balance tubes. There's one in each bowl to transmit air cleaner pressure into the bowls. This provides the pressure differential necessary for fuel flow through the various systems.
Right, Tech. And in the primary bowl, the air cleaner vent inlet has a small baffle. The baffle prevents fuel from being forced up through the air cleaner vent tube during very tight turns.
The operation of the float system is exactly like any other carburetor, so there's no need to go into that. In fact, let's cover only the system operations that differ somewhat from other carburetors. It'll sure save a lot of time.
Good idea, Tech. And the idle system is one that is different, so let's cover that next. Each primary barrel has its own idle system. Like other idle systems, each one starts at the main metering jet in the primary metering body. The idle tube is suspended in the main well and contains a restriction to limit the flow of fuel. The air bleed for the idle system is located in the carburetor air horn, but the air passage goes into the main metering body to mix air and fuel. The idle passage separates in the metering body to supply the idle port and the idle transfer port. The idle mixture screw is also in the metering body, controlling the flow to the idle discharge port. The operation of the idle system in relation to the amount of throttle opening is exactly the same as in other carburetors. The idle port runs the show until the throttle is partially opened. Then the idle transfer port supplies the required additional fuel.
I notice that there are idle air bleeds in the secondary side, exactly like the ones on the primary side. I've never seen that on any other carburetor.
Glad you noticed, Tony. And you're right. There's a secondary idle system, too. You better clue us in, Jack.
Okay, Tech. The secondary idle system flows any time the engine is running, until the secondary throttle's open. This constant flow helps to maintain the correct fuel level in the secondary bowl. The fuel supply for the secondary idle system is not adjustable. The amount of fuel flow depends entirely upon the amount of vacuum applied at the discharge port. And, as in the primary idle system, additional fuel is supplied through the transfer port as the secondary throttle valves begin to open. The main metering system on the primary side is entirely contained in the metering body, except for passages to the discharge nozzles in the booster venturis and the air bleed passages. There are different size metering jets in the primary system for manual transmissions and torque flight. The larger jets, used with manual transmissions, allow more fuel to flow than those used with torque flight.
There are lean primary jets available for this carburetor for use in high-altitude areas. You'll find them listed in the reference book for this session and the service bulletins.
Well, how about lean jets for the secondary metering system?
There are no replaceable jets in the secondary side, Tony. The metering restrictions are drilled into the secondary metering body, and as usual, you won't find any power valve in the secondary side either.
Sounds like the power enrichment system is our next subject.
That's right, Tech, and it's really a very simple one. The power valve extends right into the fuel bowl, with the operating diaphragm extending into a vacuum chamber in the main body of the carburetor. Here's how it works. The diaphragm is always exposed to manifold vacuum through a passage in the throttle body and the carburetor main body. So when the vacuum is high, the diaphragm holds the valve closed. A drop in manifold vacuum, when the throttle valves are open so that the engine demands more fuel, releases the diaphragm and allows the power valve spring to open the valve to the fuel bowl. The extra fuel goes through the valve and two passages into the main discharge passages to add to the fuel supply for the main metering jets. The extra fuel will be supplied as long as manifold vacuum is reduced. The accelerator pump also adds extra fuel to the primary bores. The pump on this carburetor is a diaphragm type, operated by a lever riding on a cam attached to the primary throttle valve shaft. The pump assembly attaches directly to the bottom of the primary bowl. The passage to the discharge nozzles runs diagonally through the metering body and into the carburetor main body through a cast boss in the top of the power valve vacuum chamber.
The Holley 4-barrel has a needle-type discharge check, something like the fuel bowl inlet needle. You'll find the needle under the discharge nozzle attaching screw.
I'm anxious to find out about those vacuum-operated secondary throttle valves. The setup doesn't look too complicated to me.
Glad to hear it, Tony. It is pretty easy to understand. First of all, be sure you understand that the throttles are not operated by manifold vacuum. The vacuum comes from the primary and secondary venturis. Now, here's what happens. As soon as the primary throttles start to open, the flow of air through the primary venturis creates a low-pressure area in the venturi throats. The passage from the primary venturi to the secondary throttle diaphragm is in the right-hand primary throat. There's a draft tube extending from the primary vacuum pickup into the venturi throat. The airflow past the draft tube reduces the pressure even further. Any increase in the speed of the airflow will mean an even greater drop in pressure. When engine demand reaches the point where the primary bores can no longer supply enough fuel air mixture, the reduced pressure at the primary pickup will be strong enough to start moving the diaphragm against the diaphragm spring force, and thus start opening the secondary throttle valves. As the secondary throttles open, the airflow through the right-hand secondary venturi creates a low-pressure area at the secondary vacuum pickup. So the diaphragm is then subject to vacuum from both pickup points.
It looks to me like the low pressure at the primary pickup would just pull air from the secondary pickup instead of operating the diaphragm. There doesn't appear to be anything to stop it.
Under some conditions, that's just what happens, Tony. Remember, we don't want the secondary throttles to open until the engine demands extra fuel and air. That's the reason for pulling air through the secondary pickup, to delay secondary throttle opening. You take it from there, Jack.
Okay, Tech. The secondary pickup port is somewhat smaller than the primary pickup. So there is a limit to the amount of air that can flow from the secondary to satisfy the low pressure area at the primary. Let's call that limit the pressure balance point. When the balance point is reached, the secondary pickup acts similar to an orifice. Then, as the pressure decreases at the primary pickup, the extra low pressure pulls the air out of the diaphragm chamber. Atmospheric pressure below the diaphragm starts to open the secondary throttle, creating a low pressure area at the secondary pickup. The choke, fast idle, and distributor advance operations on the Holley 4-barrel are so close to those on our other carburetors that we don't really need to describe them. We'll talk about adjusting these items and others as soon as Tech gets that usual problem off his mind.
I thought you'd never say it, Jack. The problem is we're running out of record. Will someone turn it over?
There are a number of important adjustments on the Holley 4-barrel carburetor. We'll start with a bowl vent valve on top of the primary fuel bowl. When the primary throttle valves are in curb idle position, the bowl vent valve should be 3/32 of an inch off its seat. To adjust the valve position, bend the curved section of the operating rod.
The secondary bowl is vented too, but it doesn't have a vent valve. The vent outlet is located between the top of the bowl and the air cleaner seat.
The accelerator pump lever must have proper clearance to assure that the correct volume of fuel will be delivered. The clearance is adjusted with the primary throttle valves wide open. Now here's how to check it. Hold the throttle wide open and push the short diaphragm lever to the full extent of its travel. You should be able to insert a 15,000th feeler between the lever and the adjusting screw. If you can't, turn the screw in. If there's too much clearance, turn the screw out until a feeler just fits.
If the clearance is off in either direction, you won't get enough fuel through the discharge nozzles. Now let's check out the other side of the carburetor, Jack.
Coming right up, Tech. To check the vacuum kick adjustment, measure the choke valve opening with at least 10 inches of vacuum applied to the diaphragm and the choke lever held up lightly. On cars with manual transmission, measure with a number 39 drill. On torque flight cars, use a number 53. If you have to change the vacuum kick setting, carefully bend the loop in the operating link.
Don't try to make the adjustment by bending the diaphragm bracket. You'll wind up ruining the diaphragm or causing a bind in the linkage.
That's right, Tech. There are two other adjustments that depend on the position of the choke valve: the fast idle cam position and the choke unloader. Always set the cam position first. Open the primary throttles far enough so the fast idle tang rests on the second highest speed step and against the high speed step. Then, lift up lightly on the choke valve control lever. You should be able to insert a number 53 drill between the choke valve and the air horn wall with a slight drag on the drill. If the drill cannot be inserted, bend the fast idle tang downward to open the choke valve further. If the drill is too loose in the opening, bend the tang upward slightly.
If you're making this adjustment on the car, always check the engine fast idle speed after bending the tang. We'll see why a little later.
I think I figured out the choke unloader adjustment. Now check me out and see if I'm right.
Go to it, Tony.
There's another tang on the primary throttle valve shaft that contacts a pin on the fast idle cam when the engine is cold and the choke is closed. The tang kicks the cam and choke linkage at wide open throttle, opening the choke a small amount to clear a flooded engine. So, to open the choke further, I'll lift up on the choke lever and bend the tang toward the pin. If the choke opens too far, the tang should be bent away. What's the correct opening, Tech?
Use a 5/32 drill shank between the choke valve and the air horn, Tony.
Next on the docket is a secondary throttle valve adjustment. This adjustment assures that the secondary throttles will not stick closed. Here's what happens. If the secondary throttle valves were allowed to close tightly in their bores, the valves could stick until a strong enough pull developed in the diaphragm, so you'd get a sudden opening of the secondaries. So, turn the adjusting screw all the way out so it doesn't contact the secondary throttle stop lever. Hold the throttle valves closed and turn the screw in until it just touches the lever, and then give it another half turn. This will keep the throttle valves from sticking in the bores. Float level measurements are taken with the bowls upside down. On the primary float, there should be 7/64 of an inch between the toe of the float and the bowl. You can use a drill to gauge it. The secondary float is measured at the heel. The correct clearance is 15/64 of an inch. As always, to change the float level, bend the float tang.
This gauge is one I haven't seen before, but it looks like it has something to do with fuel level.
That's right, Tony. It's used to check the actual fuel level with a bowl installed on the carburetor. Use it this way. Remove the lower fuel bowl attaching screw farthest from the fuel inlet. Install the gauge and special bolt and start the engine. As the fuel bowl refills, fuel will enter the gauge and indicate the level inside the bowl. The correct level reading is 9/16 for the primary bowl and 13/16 for the secondary. If the levels are incorrect, remove the bowls and reset the floats.
Be sure to play it safe and drain the bowls before you remove them. And here's a little tip. If the fuel level is off slightly, but the float level is correct, you can vary a little from the float specifications to get the correct level on the wet gauge. There's more about this in the reference book.
Thanks, Tech. Now to wind up, let's look at the idle speed and mixture adjustments.
That's another subject that needs coverage in the reference book. Why don't you just hit the important points for now, Jack?
Right, Tech. It's especially important to have the engine at normal operating temperature before you start. Then, hook up a tachometer, set the speed, find the best lean mixture, and reset the speed. You may have to work back and forth between speed and mixture a few times to get the ideal setting, but it's worth the effort. There is no fast idle screw on this carburetor. Instead, fast idle is set by bending the same tang we use to position the fast idle cam. But be mighty careful about it. It goes like this. Warm up the engine and set the tang on the lowest step of the fast idle cam. The fast idle speed with the tang on this step is specified at 700 RPM. To change the fast idle speed, insert a screwdriver in the tang slot. Turn the screwdriver to the right to increase the speed, or to the left to reduce speed. Then, hold the cam in position and flash the throttle. If the setting is correct, the engine should level out at 700.
After you set the fast idle speed, always check the fast idle cam position as Jack described earlier. You might accidentally bend the tang up or down when you turn it to adjust the speed.
Good idea, Tech. And here's another precaution. When you bend that tang for either the cam position or the fast idle speed, make sure the end of the tang is not rubbing against the back of the cam.
I can see where that would cause trouble. Now, how about carburetor overhaul on the Holley 4-barrel? It looks like a pretty easy job.
It is easy, Tony, and you probably won't have to open one very often except for removing the fuel bowls and diaphragms. If Jack will cover some of the more important tips and precautions, I'll give you a reference book that covers things more completely.
It's a deal, Tech. First of all, don't ever try to reuse any gaskets on this or any other carburetor. If you do, you're asking for trouble. There are 3 different packages available for the Holley 4-barrel, and I think Tech has the numbers in the reference book. If you only want to remove the secondary throttle diaphragm assembly, first take off the fast idle cam and choke bell crank. Then you can easily get at all 3 of the attaching screws. When you remove the primary fuel bowl and the metering body, don't forget that there's a small baffle between the bowl and the body. Note that it fits on 2 dowel pins underneath the gasket. You'll notice that the secondary metering body is attached with 6 number 5 clutch-type screws. Don't try to use another type of screwdriver on these screws, or you'll ruin the heads.
It looks to me like all the gaskets are symmetrical, so they can go on with either side out.
You're almost right, Tony. They are all symmetrical, except one. The gasket between the primary metering body and the carburetor main body goes only one way. But you can't get it on wrong, because there's only one dowel pin and a matching hole in one side of the gasket.
Right, Tech. Before you start to put the fuel bowls back on the carburetor, make sure you have new gaskets to replace all those that were removed. Also, put new O-rings on the fuel transfer tube and the bowl balance tube. Slide the bowl balance tube into the carburetor main body and put new O-rings on each end. Then, put the primary metering body and gaskets in place, using the balance tube and dowel as guides. Position the balance tube so it extends 1 5/16 inches beyond the carburetor main body. In this position, the tube will have clearance on both ends when the bowls are installed. Make sure the small baffle is in place and install the primary bowl, with the levers for the vent and accelerator pump contacting their operating arms. Be careful not to disturb the balance tube. Install the secondary metering body with new gaskets. Then carefully position the secondary bowl over the balance tube and install the 4 screws. Don't forget to use new O-ring seals on the fuel transfer tube.
Here's one you forgot to mention, Jack. Always put new gaskets on the fuel bowl attaching screws. One thing we don't need is a fuel bowl leak. I see we're close to the end of the record. So, why don't you master technicians dig into your reference book files and review the 2 basic carburation sessions we had last year, and then bury your nose in the book for this session. I think it'll be time well spent. See you next session.